What's up, Internet? Jordan here from Arrow to the Mead, and today we're going to be tasting two of my oldest meads. They are both Bochets, which is a style that people say needs quite a bit of time to really age into itself, but they are now 2 years old. So how have they churned out? Without further ado, let's find out. The first of these Bochets was a cyser recipe that I created with the very specific goal of creating an apple pie style mead. The Bochet honey was intended to introduce caramel notes. The cyser was of course intended to cover the apple portion of an apple pie. And I also added spices a la normal apple pie, cinnamon and nutmeg. The Bochet cyser finished a little over 13% ABV and with a final gravity of 10/16. The second Bochet was utter chaos. It was a recipe that I created on the spur of the moment for reasons related to inexperience I won't attempt to fully explain. And I basically just threw the kitchen sink at it in an attempt to brew that day with what I had in the house. I pitched it over the lease from a batch of vanilla chai mead. I had cheap honey on hand, so I Bochet'd the crap out of it. This is easily far and away the darkest I have ever taken Bochet honey. I mean, I practically burnt it to a crisp. I'm not even sure it was still a Bochet, to be honest. And then it turned out I didn't even have enough honey on hand to hit the final gravity I was aiming for, so I threw table sugar at it. I had some canned cinnamon pears from a friend that I just opened up and threw in there. I figured that way it'll have some flavor other than smoke and fire. And I added 10 bags of chai tea. I think at the time my plan was to lean into some of the leftover chai tea that would have been in the lease from the previous batch, but I think 10 bags was probably 8 or 9 too many for a 1-gallon batch. Anyway, this crazy pear Bochet ended a little bit over 9% ABV and with a final gravity of about 10/21. So with the basics of what these meads actually are covered, how did they churn out? The Bochet cyser has a pleasant nose. It actually smells pretty close to the apple pie I was going for. It smells like a cyser. You get a little bit of caramel and a little bit of the apple pie spices I put in there. Could be stronger on things other than the apple, but not bad. The front half of the tasting experience for the Bochet cyser is similar. It's apple forward, clearly a Bochet, a hint of the caramel and the spices. But the middle and back end of the tasting experience is empty. The hint of the spices that we had earlier disappears under some mildly astringent notes. The mead lacks body, and it seems to lack sufficient sweetness to really live up to its apple pie aspirations. According to Batch Builder's online tool, 10/16 should in theory, technically on paper, be semi-sweet, but it's clearly not sweet enough. And that does make sense considering that I didn't add any tea bags or anything like that to this one, and I expect that the apple would be somewhat acidic. There wasn't anything to balance it out, and there's not a ton of sugar. Yeah, that all makes sense. Overall, this recipe's not great, but I think it's very salvageable with some minor tweaks while still retaining the spirit of the recipe. First, it needs more sweetness, for sure. It is supposed to be apple pie, and apple pie is a sweet dessert. The mead really needs to increase its final gravity quite a bit to meet those expectations. And second, it needs more spices. This was the brew where I learned that cinnamon powder is probably not the best thing to use in meads in general, and more importantly, that you shouldn't be adding them in primary. The process of fermentation seems to manage to blow away a lot of the spices that you can introduce in primary, and they just disappear completely, and you have to reintroduce them again in secondary. Nutmeg is something that I haven't revisited since this mead, but a little bit of research shows that there are ways to add it other than the powder. The mead subreddit suggests freshly grated nutmeg in secondary, similar to the idea of cinnamon sticks in secondary. I would try both if I were to do this one again. And after all that's done, honestly, I would keep it in secondary for bulk aging, and I would check back in another 1 to 2 years, just like the age we're at right now, to see how those adjustments had fared. I think it's possible that it might need more tannin as well, but I hesitate to jump straight to adding more tannin from the beginning of the recipe while I'm making several other changes that would impact the balance of sweetness, tannin, and acidity. The crazy pear Bochet actually also has a surprisingly pleasant nose. The pear comes through, in spite of the fact that I'd read pear is a flavor that fades and we're 2 years in. I thought it might have been gone by now. It's still a very pear-forward aroma. And similar to the cyser, the front half of that tasting experience is also pear-forward. And similar to the cyser, the middle to back end is empty. Although unfortunately, unlike the cyser, the astringency in the middle to back end of this one is intense. The swallow and the retronasal in particular are hollow and acrid. It carries the sting of bad cough medicine and charcoal with the mouthfeel of ashes. There's no body, no sweetness, no fruit. There's just nothing in the middle to back ends of the tasting experience here that is at all enjoyable. Just ashes. So in spite of a striking number of similarities in the nose and the initial taste on both of these very different Bochets, the crazy pear one ends up being totally unsalvageable in my opinion. It's not something that I would brew again, not without major tweaks, but the thing is the tweaks would be so big that you might as well start over. You would lose the core identity of this one. The apple pie, or the cyser Bochet, that was a good idea, and I do see how it was close in some ways. It definitely needs tweaking, but I'm interested in trying that one again at some point. I think I could get it there. This crazy pear Bochet, just don't try. Whatever I did there, I'll link the recipes for both in the bottom. Whatever I did for the crazy pear, just don't try that. It was dumb, didn't work. Anyway, that brings me to the takeaways, which in my opinion is the fun part of a good tasting video. And honestly, when it comes to these two Bochets, especially tasted on the heels of a tasting video for my oldest traditional, it makes me ask myself, is a Bochet a good style for beginners to be brewing? Hear me out. When I started brewing, I thought the Bochet was the perfect beginner style because I wanted to brew a ton of new batches, and I wanted to buy honey in bulk in order to save while I was making sure I had enough honey for all of these batches, and then I wanted to buy cheap honey so that I could afford to buy the 60-pound pails of honey, and I thought if I Bochet that honey, well, that's perfect. Conventional wisdom is that you shouldn't use expensive honey on a Bochet anyway because the caramelization process blows away a lot of the delicate aromas that the expensive varietals bring, so it's a waste of money to Bochet them. So I thought that Bochetting really cheap honey meant that I could transform the most fast food grade honey I could find into something complex and nuanced with a little bit of elbow grease and a fun brew day. More batches, more fun, and less money. And what's more, they tell us that beginners make a lot of mistakes, but that time heals all brews. And Bochets are a style that's supposed to need a lot of time to age, so I figured that by the time my Bochet was old enough to drink, it'd be so old that all of the beginner mistakes would be covered up anyway. As best I could tell from my newbie experience, Bochets were perfect. They were cheap, they were easy, they were self-correcting. How could it get any better than that? But these Bochets are both 2 years old, and while one of them is salvageable with tweaks, neither of them is good as is. And while I admit I can't predict with 100% accuracy what more age will do to them, I'm doing my best to project their future path based on the not insignificant amount of time they already have under their belts, and neither is promising. While I did mention some astringency and some harsher notes that I think time will improve, the biggest underlying problem with both Bochets is an empty void in the middle to back end of the tasting experience. There is no complexity or body to be found there. The utter lack of body is not among the signature ash and fire flavors that young Bochets are known for. And time by itself is not particularly well known from being able to create something from nothing. Rather, time tends to evolve existing flavors. Like maybe sometimes you will find yourself with an overwhelming flavor that buries some of the lighter and more delicate ingredients you added, and as time rounds out some of the overwhelming flavors, the lighter ones are able to come forward and reveal to your palate much more complexity than you originally perceived there to be there. But ultimately, I think in situations like that, what we're dealing with is flavors and aromas that were there the whole time. The way they present and play off of each other changed, but age didn't introduce a flavor that didn't previously exist. And what concerns me is that both of these Bochets taste like they're just missing half of their tasting experience. I don't think time alone will fix that. I really think they needed to go through finishing and balancing. And that's where I get to this problem that makes me think, are Bochets good for beginners? If you make Bochets that you expect to age for several years or more as a brand new brewer, you will end up tasting them alongside the latest and greatest brews that you've been able to produce with several years of experience under your belt. In all of the years that those Bochets will spend aging, you will continue to hone your skills. And when I think about the pitfalls of my early brewing, some of which I made on these Bochets, and many of which I see other new brewers posting about online, I realize that they're not all mistakes that time will fully heal. When you are that new, the scars of newbie mistakes will likely remain, and when those Bochets are finally cracked open, I think it will be hard to see anything other than the missed opportunities, even if they're not bad meads. But you guys know me, I'm always saying you should brew in whatever way brings you joy. So it should come as no surprise to you that I'm not going to assert beginners should stay away from Bochets or any other particular style of mead. Rather, I'm going to come up with some suggestions that I think might be able to help you protect yourself against common beginner pitfalls in any mead you brew that you expect to age for a long period of time. And the first one is that instead of winging it, you should genuinely consider following someone else's well-vetted recipe that's already been balanced by someone with experience. Find a reliable recipe source and check it with other members of the community on the Discord or the Reddit or something like that, and make sure that everyone else thinks it looks like a good recipe too. See if you can find other people who have brewed it successfully and enjoy it. And perhaps more importantly, ask if they think it was a well-made recipe. See if you can get people to rate it from the perspective of scoring in a competition rather than their subjective opinion of whether or not it's the thing they enjoy drinking. Because ultimately that's the point of trying to follow someone else's recipe, not necessarily guaranteeing that you will enjoy it, because that level of subjectivity always leaves some possibility that it just won't be for you, but to increase the chances that you end up with a well-made product. And one of the reasons for that is that a well-made product is something that you can so much more easily give away to friends and family who happen to have palates that may be more compatible with that recipe than yours, and be confident that you're giving them something quality. It also means that if you want to do something like maybe keep a handful of bottles and taste it once a year for the next several years to see how age impacts this mead for your own educational purposes, even if the mead is not your favorite particular flavor profile, with a quality mead, you can invite a couple of friends over to crack open the bottle, give tasting notes, make an event of it. All you need is the one little small sample taste for yourself, and you can find friends that enjoy it enough that they'll polish off the bottle. It won't go to waste. And that will be a lot more rewarding, at least in my experience, than brewing something that you're afraid or ashamed to give to anyone because you don't think it's any good. On the flip side, I also have the experience of brewing stuff that ends up not really being my favorite flavor combination, but it's well made. If I'm trying to figure out what bottle I want to give to someone, I never hesitate to reach for those that are well made, even if they're not my flavor profile. My second suggestion is that you should seriously consider bulk aging your meads until they taste good. Once you bottle, time is the only tool you will have at your disposal for trying to get your mead to taste better. If it turned out you missed something and time won't heal that particular problem, you will have no recourse. But if you keep it in a carboy, you are reserving the right to use any and every tool at your disposal to address problems in your mead if it turns out that time isn't quite doing what you wanted it to. You can balance it, add tannin powders, add more honey, you can add spices, you can blend it with other meads, whatever it is that you gotta do, you can still do it if you've kept it in a carboy. And frankly, based on my personal experience so far, I would advocate for this option regardless of how long you're expecting to age the mead for and regardless of how much experience you have. More options is always better than none. But I do think it's especially important if you're trying to brew something like a Bochet that's expected to age for a long period of time. I think it's doubly important if you're a brand new brewer, and I think it's critically important if you're trying to come up with your own Bochet recipe. And I say critically important if you're trying to come up with your own custom Bochet recipes here, because I know that telling new brewers to follow someone else's recipe is old hat. I'm practically a broken record repeating that advice to you guys at this point. I know that's all over the internet, on the forums, on Reddit, Discord, whatever, but I also remember what it's like being a brand new brewer. I've only been at this a couple years, and I know that a huge part of the fun for me was trying to come up with my own recipes. So if that's you, if you get a lot of your joy from trying to come up with fun, new, interesting recipes to try, and you really want to do a Bochet, keeping it in a carboy until it either tastes good or you've learned enough that you know what it's missing and you can figure out how to finish it so that it tastes good, is the best advice I can come up with to protect you against the possibility of being disappointed in a Bochet that you've spent years aging and building up anticipation for. Third, this may seem obvious, but maybe try something that doesn't need to age for as long. Another thing that beginners often go up against is the struggle to be patient. You really want to try some of your meat and see how it's tasting, and When you don't have any on hand to try, patience is a little bit more difficult to exercise. Once you have a handful of brews under your belt and a handful of bottles in the cellar, it gets a lot easier. If you really need to, you can scratch that itch by going, hey, let's taste this thing that's a year old now, instead of going, well, this one thing that I've been working on, this only brew that I have, I really want to taste, I'm gonna bottle it because I want it to be in bottles, and oh my god, I'm gonna die. If you start off with something like a Bochet and are planning to age it for like 3 to 5 years, you're gonna be waiting a long time. On the other hand, you could make a short mead, something like a hydromel, that might be ready in a matter of months instead of 3 to 5 years. And if you really have to make a Bochet, try this on for size. Do both. I know not everyone has the space to just throw more brews at the problem, but seriously, when you're first getting started, if you have the space to do it, consider doing both meads that will age for a long period of time so that you can exercise full patience on those ones and make sure that they can become the best mead they can be, and do shorter ones that you can be a little bit reckless with, and it's okay because they're expected to be done very quickly, and if they don't come out great, you'll just make another one and be ready for version 2 in 3 months. Time is one of your resources. It'll feel like a big waste if a Bochet you aged for 5 years turns out badly. You won't care nearly as much if a hydromel that you aged for 3 months doesn't turn out fantastic. And for those who really are genuinely deeply limited on space, then I'm sorry that you can't throw another brew at the problem, and I totally understand that. I'm going through the remodel right now and I don't have a lot of brew space either, hence all the tasting videos, so I getcha. If that's the situation that you're in, then my advice is think seriously about what part of this brings you joy. If you want to age that Bochet for 5 years, that's going to take up a lot of space and time. How many other meads could you have brewed in that time? And is it that important to do a Bochet? Will the one Bochet bring you more joy than the 24 hydromels, or the half dozen mellomels, or whatever else it is that works out to be over that time that you could have done? I can't actually answer that question for you. It's not rhetorical. I'm not saying it's a foregone conclusion that the Bochet is a bad option. You might love the Bochet that much and it might be your priority, but just spend some time thinking about it and make that decision for yourself instead of starting the Bochet on a whim and then finding yourself trapped. And with all of that said, I feel like I need to add the disclaimer that obviously the possibility that between the time you start a Bochet and the time you open it, you will have improved greatly is a risk that any brewer technically does take. It's not limited to new brewers, but I'm focusing on new brewers because of a combination of beginner gains and sort of minimum acceptable quality. By beginner gains, what I mean is that when we are brand new, there is so much to learn that we take leaps and bounds forward. But the more we learn, the less noticeable the improvements we make become. There's diminishing returns on our rate of improvement as we invest time and energy into learning more about brewing. And by minimum acceptable quality, what I mean is that if we're being brutally honest, within the first couple of months, any from-scratch recipe you come up with is fairly likely to fall somewhere on the like total stinker to decent spectrum. On the flip side, after a couple years, you're more likely to have cranked your way up to decent being sort of like the worst case scenario, and your good meads will be capping out at competition level. So between the beginner gains concept and the minimum acceptable quality level increasing as you get better, yeah, no one is immune to the risk I'm describing of being disappointed by a mead that took a long time to age because of how much better you've gotten in the time it was aging. But new brewers are at much higher risk of it turning out unacceptably poor if they don't take any of the precautions I'm recommending, like keeping it in the carboy to age. And obviously none of this stuff is a hard set rule. You could have somebody that brews half-assedly for the first couple of years and then starts to go really hard on their learning in year 3. But I think I've spent enough time describing this in enough detail that you guys can extrapolate, and I'm gonna shut up now. So ultimately, remember to brew whatever style brings you joy, even if that's a Bochet. Just keep in mind that some styles are expected to age longer than others, and time is one of our most valuable resources. Before you sink years into aging a mead that you have high hopes for, consider taking some of the precautions that I've described, like keeping it in that carboy for bulk aging until you're sure it's turned out the way you want. Anyway, this has been Jordan from Heir to the Mead. Thank you for joining me, and have a good however long until I see you again. 'Cause I'm still looking